He kōna e purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Just a quick warning, this podcast contains descriptions of violence some listeners might find confronting.
Walked into the courtroom with guards around him, like, what do they think was going to happen? It was, like a rock star.
Julia Appelgren still remembers Ernie's entrance at the second trial. And the guards she mentioned, well, police decided there was enough risk to Ernie's safety that he needed extra protection.
Quite arrogant of the way he was brought in, like he was the key to everything. Like he had something to say. He was treated very well.
As Ross's fiancée, you'd expect Julie to dislike Ernie. After all, his testimony would be the difference between Ross getting to attend his own wedding after the trial or being sent back to prison. Local church minister and friend Jeff Howarth was meant to officiate Julie and Ross's big day. He was also at the trial to see Ernie in the witness box.
And if they didn't have that witness there, then I don't think the prosecution against Ross could possibly have succeeded. And I thought, if a trial depends so much upon what I regarded as a thoroughly unreliable witness, then what really is the value of the trial?
For the second time, Ross's fate hinged on the word of Ernie, a 200 times convicted fraudster. He'd helped send Ross to prison once and was now set to do it again. But this time, the playing field was more even. Unlike in the first trial, Ross's lawyers had much more ammunition with which to challenge Ernie's credibility and reliability. Let's tick them off. There are the benefits he got for helping police, the $30,000, early prison release, the motel stay, and a new identity. His first police interviews, where he said he didn't know anything about the murder. And his handwritten note saying, "I never saw it done." Ross's defence was stronger too. He had Felix, his new alibi witness, who claimed he'd seen Ross heading towards the toilet around the time Darcy was attacked. Ross just needed Felix to turn up. Problem was, it was not a given. You're listening to Nark, an RNZ investigative podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wesley Smith. This is episode 13, The Jack-Up. As you've heard, Ernie was not exactly a willing witness at Ross's retrial. Like so many things about this case, it's not entirely clear how police convinced him to return to New Zealand to give evidence again. Personally, I think the tense meeting Ernie had with head cop Peter Jenkinson before the second trial would have been pretty compelling. The one where Jenkinson warned Ernie police could play dirty if they wanted to and alert Australian authorities to the fact Ernie was living in their country illegally. Though this, well, it's a threat really, was never mentioned to the jury. All they were told was that the Crown had agreed to cover Ernie's business costs. But as Keith Davies later reported, that wasn't all.
Ernie had a number of requests, including yet another new name and passport and New Zealand citizenship for his fiancée. Unconfirmed reports suggest she was indeed given a New Zealand passport. Roger Chambers recalls meeting Ernie and his bride-to-be. Chambers was under strict instructions from Ernie not to disclose to his English doctor fiancé anything about his background. I remember being most uncomfortable about that at the time, says Chambers. I told him it would be bound to come out one day, but he was insistent. He wanted to start a new life, and I had my instructions.
Chambers was right. It would come out in an extraordinary way, but that day was still years in the future. Back in 1992, with police having again agreed to Ernie's demands, their star witness was ready to go.
The Crown calls Ernie.
Prosecutor Bruce Squire welcomed Ernie to the stand on the Monday of the second week of the trial. To ward off the expected defence attack strategy, Squire and Ernie raised the issue of the $30,000 payment themselves. Ernie also mentioned his early release, the motel stay, though Squire called this protective custody, as well as the fact police had agreed to pay the costs he incurred for appearing at the second trial.
To cover my business expenses, I've had to employ staff this week to cover my position while I'm away here, and I've asked the Crown to meet those charges.
That amount ended up being just over $2,000. Then Ernie started the account he'd had to tell many times by then, his graphic description of that Sunday morning murder.
Ross had been working at a vat with his paddle.
Taking the jury
He went into the room very, very quickly with this paddle.
through every brutal detail.
Then there was another crack. There's another one, I'm sure there were 3.
The shock he felt,
Millions of things went through my head.
and the chilling conversations he had with Ross afterwards.
I said, what happened to the paddle with, blood and stuff? He reckons he'd boil it up. He said the hospital had rung the prison. They didn't know what to treat Darcy for. He thought that was quite a joke. Laughed about that.
Ernie was consistent, sticking with the story he'd told Ross's first trial.
He told me that he would remember me on the outside.
With vivid and convincing strokes, Ernie had painted Ross as a calculating, cold-blooded killer. Someone who found humour in the horrific. Ross's lawyer, Peter Williams, then started the most pivotal cross-examination of the whole trial. Dismantle Ernie, and Ross walked free. If Ernie was still standing by the end, Ross was finished. Williams had a lot of ground to cover, especially with all the detail the jury in the first trial never heard. Williams began with Ernie's first police interviews, where he didn't breathe a word about witnessing a murder. Ernie explained his original statements to the police were lies.
I was in such a vulnerable position with the immense pressure at the time. I didn't want to say or do anything positive to give the police any indication of what was going on or what had gone on.
Williams then touched on Ernie's 2 anonymous notes written after the murder. To remind you, in one he wrote, referring to the killing, "I never saw it done." Williams asked,
surreptitiously, you're sending these 2 notes that have been produced in court.
That is correct. Disguised.
It's not that you were trying to get yourself into a position to bargain with the authorities to get some advantages to yourself.
I hardly think so.
I suggest to you that originally you held out to police small pieces of evidence that you thought might tempt them to enter into some arrangement with you to your benefit. What do you say to that? If giving a statement, giving anonymous letters, what do you say to that?
By disguising my writing, of course. I didn't try to get them interested. I tried to get them interested in solving a murder. I wasn't trying to get them interested in getting at me. I didn't want to become involved in the damn thing. If you read my second letter, you'll see I didn't want to get involved in it.
and that was it. That was all Williams asked about the notes. Julie, watching all of this, was pretty disappointed.
Was it obvious to you that Peter Williams had only had a week or 2 to prepare?
Yeah. I kept thinking, is that it? Is that it? Where's the fire on this?
There are so many other questions I want to know the answers to as well. Ones I've touched on before. Like, why didn't Ernie name Ross as the attacker in his notes? They were anonymous after all. And for the same reason, why, in his note, did he say he never saw it done? After all, these notes are significant as they are Ernie's first known account of the murder, and crucially, as I've said before, one he'd apparently authored before police had offered him anything. Look, Ernie may have had perfectly reasonable answers to these questions, but because they weren't raised, the jury was none the wiser. Now, to be fair to Williams, he was really effective when it came to highlighting the glaring differences between Ernie's account and those of his fellow Crown witnesses. First, he asked Ernie about his claim that Gordon was involved in the murder.
You're alleging Gordon was part of some conspiracy to deliberately block the view of the water at the time of the assault upon Tahira.
Yes.
Both Stedman and Gordon have both denied that. Does that alter your evidence on that?
Naturally they would.
Remember, Stedman is Jim Stedman, the prison guard in the kitchen when the attack happened.
Why would Mr. Stedman deny that?
Mr. Stedman was not, I told you this before, was not actually carrying out his correct duties, I felt. I have no doubt in my mind Stedman knew something was going to happen, and he was quite happy to be entertained by the prisoners inside and outside his office while this event happened, even though he might want to tell you something to the contrary. And I informed police of all of that the moment I was taken out of the prison.
I haven't found any solid evidence to back up these claims about Stedman. And as we've heard, all his former colleagues think he was a stand-up guy. Oddly, Stedman was never asked at the trial to respond to Ernie's allegations, and I can't ask Stedman myself because he died in 2018. Williams then quizzed Ernie about his claim Gordon threatened him twice, throwing him up against the wall in the shower and then telling Ernie to keep his mouth shut while sharpening a kitchen knife.
What do you say to that he denies having these conversations with you?
Well, for a kitchen a little bit smaller than this courtroom, and when you're stuck in there 10 hours a day, I can hardly imagine not having some conversation with the chap. You'd have to be stupid not to talk to the chap who was in there.
Williams had ensured a question mark hung over the Crown's other witness, Gordon. He then moved on to the inmate Martin. Williams asked if Ernie had witnessed the murder, what did he make of Martin's revelation he was in the room when it happened?
Absolute garbage.
Are you suggesting a Crown witness would tell lies on oath?
I would say that under those circumstances, there is some problem why he has said that. That is definitely not correct why he was in the room. In fact, I would stake my life on that one. If Martin wants to tell you to the contrary, he is obviously making up a whole heap of lies to feather his own cap. There's no benefit for me coming here today for you people. I have been totally exposed. I have come here to give evidence because I have to live with myself for the rest of my life.
In those few words, Ernie had touched on the most crucial question confronting the jury. Why was he testifying? Was it solely an act of conscience and altruistic desire to see the right man face justice? Or was it simply personal gain and his own get-out-of-jail-free card? You can guess which theory Williams ran with.
I suggest to you that you've used every possible ploy to knock the system to your advantage financially in relation to this whole matter. What do you say to that?
No, you're dreaming.
I suggest to you that you've lied in every respect where you've incriminated Mr. Appelgren. What do you say to that?
You're wrong, you're totally wrong. I haven't gained a damn thing out of it. Why would I want to come and expose myself again in a court today? You're barking up the wrong tree. The facts, as far as I'm concerned, speak for themselves.
I suggest that you and your lawyer have probably had something like $60,000 out of this so far.
I have no idea what Mr. Chambers' bill was. I certainly didn't get that sort of money. Money paid to me was totally for relocation, and to cost that and a lot more to relocate me, I can tell you that now.
Okay, so we now know the figure Ernie got was actually around $30,000, but it's interesting that he told the court it was totally for relocation. You'll remember that's not how Ernie and detectives characterised the money during their negotiations. In police documents, the payment is described, at least in part, as being a reward. Ernie himself also called it that. And most importantly, in my view, the police paperwork for Ernie's final cheque described it as a, quote, final reward and settlement amount. But Williams didn't call any of this out in court. And I think, though I don't know for sure, that's because he hadn't seen any of these documents. But in his cross-examination of Ernie, Williams was at least able to highlight what Ernie and the Crown hadn't told the jury at the first trial.
When you gave evidence at the first trial, did you tell the jury you were living in a motel at the time?
No, they didn't ask me. I was in protective custody. I may as well have been inside.
Ross's lawyer at the original trial, Mary Beth Sharp, didn't know Ernie was being put up in a motel. She questioned him about his living arrangements, but didn't ask for specifics, and Ernie didn't volunteer any. At the retrial, Williams confronted Ernie about this evasion.
When she put to you about your present prison institution, you weren't being truthful. Why didn't you correct her and say, I was in a motel, but I've got guards?
I have no idea why I said that. That was never asked. Was I in a prison, in a motel, a 5-star luxury yacht? I didn't have to answer it. It was never put to me. Was I in a prison or was I in a 5-star hotel?
However, Ernie's motel accommodation was nothing, Williams said, compared to the $30,000 he received from police.
The first trial, did you tell the jury you expected no benefit from giving evidence?
Oh, yes. Nothing.
Later, after the first trial, were you paid the $30,000?
Not straight after the trial, no.
I didn't say straight after the trial, I said after the trial.
Yes.
So if the first jury believed you were getting nothing, you misled them.
No, because at that stage I didn't know I was going to get anything.
Williams then brought up Ernie's statement dated the 22nd of February 1985, the one in which he formally implicated Ross for the first time.
Had you made any negotiations prior to making that statement with the police?
No, I had not.
Is that what you told the jury last trial?
That's correct. I hadn't made any monetary negotiations, no. My lawyer was dealing with the police on my behalf for my travel backwards and forwards and for my security and my relocation back to where I was going to be going after the trial, and those matters were dealt with through the proper channels.
This is one of those kind of moments any defence lawyer hopes for, when a witness says something seemingly at odds with documented evidence. In this instance, it was a January 1985 letter from Jenkinson's superior that explicitly mentioned discussions between Ernie and the police about money he could receive. For the jury's benefit, Williams read part of that letter aloud.
It goes on. It seems that compromise may be possible. For example, Ernie would have accepted an agreement allowing him a new identity on his release from prison in 1986 and sufficient funds for him to find his own way overseas, but he has been firmly instructed to await our reaction to the much more ambitious conditions put forward by his solicitor. Does that ring a bell?
I have no knowledge of that. I have hardly seen any documentation of anything to do with this thing at all. What negotiations were done, I gave my lawyer what I wanted, and because of pure inducement reasons to come to court today, I've not wanted to know what the legal or the whole setup was. I just didn't want to know about it because I wanted to come here with a clear mind. I came here with another reason other than monetary, as I guess you were trying to throw in my face.
Now, it doesn't appear that Ernie's answer here is accurate. There are multiple documents proving he had direct contact with police about what he wanted. First, there's Jenkinson's report dated the 14th of January 1985 that we heard in episode 6. Jenkinson wrote,
I have discussed this with Ernie and he would be happy with a new identity and sufficient funds for him to relocate himself.
And then there are the letters Ernie sent to police in March 1985, listing his demands.
I want $5,000 in country of origin, which isn't unreasonable, and a free passport, driver's license, no convictions attached, a work visa, air ticket too. I would of course welcome any shorter time in prison.
But Williams didn't ask Ernie about those letters because, that's right, Ross's lawyers later claimed they weren't disclosed to the defence at the retrial. Watching Ernie trading blows with Williams was Robert Mannion. Given he was a journalist watching it through a neutral lens, I was interested in Robert's assessment of Ernie.
I was, at the very least, open to the idea maybe this guy is telling the truth, yeah. I think I had joined in the spirit of the people thinking Ross was innocent. And I won't say that I changed that completely, but I could see that the prosecution case had some weight to it.
However, for Julie and Jeff Howarth, Ernie was simply untrustworthy.
No, he believed that if he gave certain statements that he could get an earlier release. He was in on fraud charges. We knew that what incentives he'd received, money, motel stay.
I felt he had rehearsed exactly what he was going to say, and he was giving me the impression of a person who was acting a part. He was a very cocky, self-confident person. He was the sort of person that I believed would not hesitate to tell a lie for his own advantage.
When the prosecution case closed, Peter Williams asked Justice Thomas to dismiss Ross's murder charge. He said the major conflicts between Ernie, Gordon and Martin's accounts meant asking the jury to even consider a verdict was unfair. But Justice Thomas refused. It meant Williams had to push forward and present the defence case to the jury.
Mr. Appelgren will testify he'd gone to the toilets at the time of the killing. He will also tell you the evidence against him has been fabricated. You'll also hear from Mr. Appelgren's fiancée, Julie, who sat on the jury in his first trial. They intend to marry in July. It is quite a remarkable turn of events, really, when you come to think about it.
Now, you may have noticed Williams hadn't mentioned his key alibi witness, the former inmate, Felix. That's because Williams didn't know if Felix would even show up, so he started his case assuming he wouldn't appear. Ross was the first defence witness to take the stand.
I am from Auckland and I'm a painter by occupation. I am the accused in this case.
As we've explained in earlier episodes, we've used AI combined with recordings of Ross to create an artificial version of his voice. So what you're about to hear will be the exact words Ross said in court, but created by AI for this podcast. During Ross's testimony, Williams had Ross run through the day's events and clearly outlined that he was in the toilet when Darcy was attacked. Interestingly, unlike the first trial, where Ross's testimony could still have placed him in the kitchen at the time of the attack, at the retrial, Ross was a bit more vague with timing, just saying he went to the toilet and when he came back, the nurse was already attending to Darcy. When it came time for Bruce Squire to cross-examine Ross, he repeated many of the same questions asked by prosecutor Stuart Grieve in the first trial. As back then, Ross again made concessions helpful to the Crown's case. That on the morning of the murder, he'd been using a paddle in the kitchen near the lunchroom. That he could not explain why, out of all the inmates present in the kitchen, Ernie named him as the killer. Ross also agreed he'd asked Ernie and another inmate to leave the lunchroom just before the attack. Though Ross said he did this because
I was one of the cooks and I needed trays for the rice when it was ready. Dishes were stacked up and they were in there drinking tea and I told them to get out there and do that.
Squire then turned his questioning to an area the prosecution hadn't explored with Ross at the first trial, his interview with a detective the day after the murder.
Well then, why did you say to him that you could talk more freely about the death of Mr. Tahira if your solicitor was present?
I think he has used his own words with that.
Are you saying you didn't use those words?
I am saying that, yes. I told him I could speak more freely on my solicitor's advice.
I come back to my question. What more could you have told him if you talked more freely on your solicitor's advice?
Absolutely nothing.
Well then, why then did you tell him you could talk more freely if you had your solicitor's advice to?
Because I always listen to my solicitors. I've never talked much to the police, as my record will show, but if my solicitor tells me to answer questions, I will, but if my lawyer is not present, I won't.
Do you know more about the death of Tahira than you have told us here today?
No, I do not.
Don't you?
No.
The importance of this point also wasn't lost on the trial judge, Justice Thomas. He decided to ask Ross about it as well.
You're not able to say whether you saw anything or heard anything that might have assisted the police at all?
After the event, the whole kitchen was talking about it, but it was just hearsay.
When Squire continued his cross-examination, he next confronted Ross about his alibi. Ross made no mention of Felix, instead saying he knew of no one who'd seen him in the toilets. The court then adjourned for lunch. During the break, and much to Ross's huge relief, Felix finally arrived. It meant when the trial resumed, the first thing Ross said to Squire was,
When you asked me, was there anybody who saw me in the toilets, was that the question? And I answered no. That's truthful, yes. I just wanted to clarify that because since then there has been developments that nobody saw me in the toilet itself.
I can only guess the jury were at least a little confused at what Ross meant. But then Peter Williams called Felix to the witness stand.
In January 1985, I was an inmate of Mount Eden Prison.
Felix said he got up at around 7 a.m. and headed off to his job in the prison officer's mess, but couldn't leave the kitchen block as its exit door was still locked. He said he spoke briefly to a prison guard, then
I came back into the kitchen area, stood around for a moment or two, I think, from memory. I spoke to Ross Appelgren.
According to Felix, Ross was standing next to his rice boiler, and he reckons they chatted for around 2 to 3 minutes. Felix then described leaving the kitchen, going to the toilet, and walking back to his cell to retrieve his book when he saw Ross again.
Ross was coming down that particular area himself on the way to the toilet. He certainly wasn't going for a shower because that had already been done by those who were up at the time. I thought I would just sit on my bed and wait until somebody came down and undid the security block or lock, however it's termed. I got my book and Ross came back to the cell block area.
Unhelpfully, apart from saying he got up at around 7 a.m, Felix doesn't give, nor is he really asked, any timings for his movements, such as when he spoke to Ross the first time, or most importantly, when exactly he saw Ross coming back from the toilet. As we know, the Crown said Darcy was likely attacked between 7:20 and 7:30 a.m. So not knowing when Felix says he spotted Ross means it's kind of hard to say with absolute certainty he even gave Ross an alibi. When prosecutor Bruce Squire started his cross-examination of Felix, he immediately took aim at that alibi. Why, asked Squire, in Felix's first police interview, did he not mention seeing Ross near the toilets?
I didn't see the relevance.
I suggest to you that you just made this up.
Oh yeah.
Is that right?
Of course it's not right.
The rest of Ross's witnesses were called to give evidence about his character. A move designed to persuade the jury Ross was a good man. Yes, he had lived a life of crime, but he wasn't the murderous thug portrayed by the prosecution. Ross's fiancée, Julie, was one of those to testify. A very different role to the one she played at the first trial.
Was there any moment where you looked across at the jury box and thought, oh, gosh, it's some journey I've taken myself from jury box to witness box?
Yeah, no, I really didn't really look at them. I don't remember looking at them in great detail at all.
Were you nervous at all?
No, not that I remember. Not that I remember, no. Well, to me it was just like speaking on Ross's behalf, really, and putting my side of things. That it didn't bother me, because I just speak from the heart. I speak from the heart.
Julie's testimony was brief. With me, she agreed to read the part of the court transcript where she had answered a question from Williams about Ross's character.
I said absolutely, I would stake my life on it. Ross has brought a lot of love and happiness into my life, and he is totally trustworthy, and he is my life. I believe in him. I've always believed in him.
And that really does sum it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, because I was very honest about that, but if I had any doubts about him and his character at all, he would not have been introduced to my children. We wouldn't have been together. But I think with all the time that we'd spent together, I believe that he talked to me about his life and everything more than he has ever talked to anybody else. He absolutely opened up to me heart and soul, and I don't believe he'd ever done that with anybody else.
Ross's priest, Jeff Howarth, was another character witness.
I said yes. I said, I understand your wish for me to be there, and if there's anything I can do to help you, then I will do it.
Was it your first time giving evidence at something like that?
Yes, it was. What I remember was that the prosecutors were aggressive and very sharp and very keen to put me down.
In the year he'd known Ross, Jeff told the jury he'd come to see him as a man with a calm and gentle nature, someone who'd been open about his criminal past and wanted to put it behind him. Prosecutor Chris Morris asked Jeff if he'd known of Ross's conviction for armed robbery.
When the prosecutors asked me, did I realise that Ross had been involved in a bank robbery and so on, I could genuinely say no, I didn't, because I wasn't inquiring about his background.
In any event, Jeff told the court it wouldn't have altered his opinion of Ross.
Is part of that also, Jeff, that priests typically believe in forgiveness?
Yes, absolutely. And forgiveness, I think, depends to some extent on the willingness of the person who's caused the offence to reassess his or her life and to admit responsibility. And I thought in those cases that's exactly what Ross was doing.
Chris Morris also had Jeff concede he couldn't speak to Ross's nature at the time of the murder because he hadn't known him then. Prosecutors are entitled to challenge witnesses in this way. Nonetheless, Jeff found it very uncomfortable.
They were trying to make me feel totally inadequate and that anything I had to say was of no value at all. And that left me thinking, what actually is this trial about? Is it about a result or is it about justice?
On the morning of the trial's last day, TV3 journalist Keith Davies and his crew filmed Julie and Ross preparing to learn Ross's fate.
Haven't had much occasion with ties.
No pride.
Both were upbeat as Julie helped Ross put on his tie.
I think that's okay. You look nice.
Keith interviewed them on the ferry trip from their home to the central Auckland courthouse.
That jury, they've heard conflicting evidence from the prosecution. Do you think they've heard enough to be able to make their minds up?
I hope so. I hope that they have really taken note of that conflicting evidence. But then you don't know how a jury's going to react.
Julie, if you were on the jury, you were going into that jury room today, having heard what you've heard this time, guilty, not guilty?
Not guilty.
The day started with Bruce Squire and Peter Williams closing addresses to the jury. Squire went first, imploring the jury to find Ross guilty of murder. He acknowledged the evidence of Ernie, Gordon and Martin had been
manifestly contradictory.
But despite that, Squire said, the Crown had not been surprised by those contradictions. It was the Crown's duty to put before the jury all evidence that bore on questions of guilt or innocence. He reminded the jury that they could not take the easy way out and decide they couldn't convict anybody on the inmates' say-so simply because they were all ratbags. Squire, though, then had a crack at the defence witness Felix, who said he'd seen Ross make a trip to the toilets. Squire suggested to the jury that Felix's evidence had been
jacked up.
Over the lunch adjournment by Ross, a development Squire said gave the defence
an unpleasant odour.
Williams was outraged. When it was his turn to speak, he came out swinging.
The suggestion of a jack-up is a scandalous allegation at the bottom of the barrel.
There was no way, Williams said, for Ross to have conspired with Felix because Ross was in custody during the lunch break, when no one had access to him. Williams wasn't finished. He then accused the Crown of buying witnesses.
The only witnesses the Crown can purchase are witnesses that are scoundrels and villains, dishonest people who commit perjury and lie. There is no rule that says the Crown can rely on those people because there were no better people available.
He said the jury in the first trial were misled into believing Ernie wouldn't gain from giving evidence. Now it was known he'd received $30,000 for motel stay and early prison release. Then there was Martin, the one-time defence witness who flipped and testified he witnessed Ross murder Darcy.
Can you really have a witness like that, who at one trial can say one thing and at the next another? What sort of hypocrite would do that? Eat at a man's table and call him bro, and then, because you're caught in a drug deal, you turn around and agree to give evidence against him.
Williams' final serve was reserved for Gordon, the man who claimed Ross told him he'd bashed Darcy. The man he said had been locked up in virtual solitary confinement, held for 23 hours a day in a medieval dungeon for almost a week before making a statement implicating Ross.
Do you think He did not have a motive to find that patch of blue sky. That was the technique they used. What a temptation it would be to join the bandwagon.
After Justice Thomas summed up, at 11 a.m, the jurors retired to consider their verdict. It was Friday, the 29th of May, 1992, less than 2 months before Ross and Julie were set to get married. Jeff Howarth was standing near Julie when the jurors returned with their decision.
I remember being in the courtroom when the verdict was pronounced. Very tense indeed.
I was so convinced that Ross was going to be cleared.
The jury had been out for less than 3.5 hours.
Ross walked back into the courtroom, ready for the verdict, and he looked at me and he was telling me to keep your chin up.
Ross looked, I thought, resigned, like he was expecting this to happen, like he wasn't really expecting to get justice.
And he knew by the look on the jury's faces that it was going to be guilty.
It was a verdict that stunned his family and friends, many of whom wept openly and huddled together for support.
Julie, I think, looked absolutely crumpled. She looked like someone who had been dealt a stinging blow. I think Ross had warned her that he probably would be found guilty, but the emotional impact on Julie was something that I won't forget.
And he threw the car keys to my son because he knew he wouldn't be going home.
In contrast, Darcy's widow Suzanne Young was satisfied with the outcome. But as she told me, her reaction was very different to what it had been in the first trial. So you weren't as celebratory for the second time round?
No. I was less certain the second time because I thought he'd probably get away with it. Like he'll go free.
But he didn't?
No, he didn't.
It was the about-face of Martin that shook Suzanne's confidence that the retrial would ascertain the truth about her husband's death.
I can't get my head around witnesses jumping the fence to the other side. So obviously they've lied.
And that fueled an awareness that the inmate witnesses in particular were perhaps more motivated by self-interest than seeing justice delivered.
Well, as I say, I always had suspicions. My alarm bells rang, it's like to sit there and listen to all these people, and I shouldn't say it, but yeah, just talking shit, really.
You were feeling you weren't getting a straight story from either side?
Yes, exactly. They're under oath for a reason.
Yeah.
But it's a joke.
Okay.
Honestly, it's a joke.
Mr. Justice Thomas then sentenced Appelgren to life imprisonment.
I mean, life to me, life is a joke in New Zealand. The sentence of life is a joke. You be good behaviour, get out in a few years. I mean, to me, life should be life.
Ross was devastated. The domestic bliss he'd shared with Julie over the last year or so had been ripped away.
We had quite a bit of evidence to show that there were prosecution witnesses who had lied. They had committed perjury and gained something out of lying. They admitted that they lied, and the second jury still believed them.
Oh, extremely emotional, extremely emotional.
I remember that night vividly when he was taken away to Mount Eden. We went there and we were all heartbroken. Or we were allowed to see him. We just too numb to even talk. We just knew there was a long road ahead.
Normally, after a guilty verdict, it can take months or even years for a case to find its next waypoint, its next break or twist. But after the retrial, it only took Ross's case a few weeks.
Tonight on 60 Minutes.
I keep wondering. I saw the promo and it was going to be a huge revelation. And I phoned Keith and I said, what's happening?
Ross Appelgren murder case.
It was now mid-June 1992. Ross had been back inside for less than a month when Julia Appelgren learned TV3 journalist Keith Davies was going to break his story about the case.
Thieves and protected witnesses.
He said, I can't tell you. He said, just watch it. And I watched it, and it was an interview with Janine.
When Janine Kelly arrived at Auckland's High Court.
Janine was Janine Kelly. She'd been the jury forewoman at Ross's second trial. Now here she was, going public with her concerns over the verdict.
So it was like me all over again.
She approached me because she'd watched one of the programs.
Keith Davies still remembers the call he got out of the blue from Janine just 2 days after the trial ended.
She had equally similar concerns and was equally troubled by what, and fronted up and went on the telly to say so.
And like any good TV journo, it didn't take Keith long to get to her with a camera crew.
I keep wondering, have I convicted an innocent man?
Keith's interview with Janine went to air on TV3 on the 21st of June 1992.
And I don't like that feeling at all. I felt absolutely terrible. I didn't want, those words were so hard to come out of my mouth. I don't even know if I said them loudly or not. All I remember is hanging my head down and just saying them as quickly as I could get them out.
Guilty.
Guilty.
Why did you have a problem with saying that word, guilty?
An overwhelming desire came.
Now you might recall, we didn't play for you Julie's public statements about the deliberations she and her jurors had in the first trial. For the same reason, we're not going to play what Janine Kelly told Keith about deliberations at the retrial. That's because it's not strictly legal to broadcast how jurors reached their verdict. Under New Zealand law, what happens in the jury room is considered private, and we could wind up being held in contempt of court. But as I mentioned to Keith, that rule seemingly wasn't always strictly enforced back in the early 90s.
And you probably are, well, to my knowledge, the only TV journalist that has interviewed not one but two jurors about the case.
That was extraordinary.
Watching Janine's interview on TV3 that evening in June 1992, Julie couldn't believe history was repeating itself.
It's like me all over again, sitting there, that poor lady.
Deja vu.
Yeah.
When Ross got wind of all of this, he was kind of pissed off.
I've never changed my story because it's the truth. But there were witnesses who changed their story more than once. I would have thought any fair-minded jury would look at that and say, there's something wrong here.
But he was also hopeful it could help his upcoming appeal. In a letter to his lawyer, Bob Hesketh, Ross wrote,
How, after hearing what that woman said, could I have been given a fair verdict? There must have been reasonable doubt.
Janine Kelly agreed to provide an affidavit to Keith Davies, who handed it to Bob Hesketh.
Your reaction then when you received this affidavit?
Oh, surprise and delight, I suppose, wouldn't be too strong a way of describing it.
Will this affidavit have any impact on the appeal?
Well, I'd have to say that the law reports are full of cases where jurors have come forward after a trial saying, well, I now wished I'd come to a different conclusion. But the difference between those sorts of cases and this particular case is that the juror in question hasn't actually said, well, I think I've come to the wrong conclusion. What is significant, I think, is that the juror is raising some very real concerns that she had, and possibly other jurors may have had, and concerns which are shared by Mr. Williams and I as to certain processes during the course of this trial.
The case of twice convicted Auckland murderer Ross Appelgren is before the Court of Appeal again today.
The date was the 15th of October 1992. Ross's trial lawyer, Peter Williams QC, also appeared for him at the appeal. Opposing him on behalf of the Crown was trial prosecutor Bruce Squire QC. Things got off to a shaky start when Williams had to drop Janine Kelly's concerns from his appeal grounds. The court called it a wise move. According to a newspaper report, that was because the court hadn't given its prior permission for Janine to provide an affidavit. Williams ploughed on, telling the court he was challenging the guilty verdict on multiple grounds, that it was both unreasonable and unsupported by the evidence. Because the hearing was not audio recorded, his arguments have been recreated from media reports and his written submissions.
The main witnesses for the Crown, Ernie, Gordon and Martin, were manifestly and palpably unreliable witnesses. Their evidence contradicted each other on material points, and they each had been given inducements by the police in regard to giving evidence against the appellant.
Williams then took aim at the summing up of the trial judge, Justice Thomas, which he described as
enthusiastically in favour of the Crown case.
Williams also criticised prosecutor Bruce Squire's claim at trial that Ross had jacked up the evidence of Felix, his key alibi witness.
Not only was it completely false and bereft of any grounds whatsoever, but it was further compounded in its prejudicial value against the appellant when the trial judge failed to make any comment whatsoever to correct the injustice of these remarks.
Felix's evidence, Williams argued, was on its own enough to raise a reasonable doubt as to Ross's guilt. In reply, Crown lawyer Bruce Squire rubbished all of Williams' arguments. Squire said his jacked-up comment at trial was entirely appropriate and that Justice Thomas's summing up had been fair. The Court of Appeal released its decision 6 weeks later.
We do not consider this verdict to have been unreasonable or unsafe.
Justice Hardy-Boys, delivering the court's judgment, dismissed Williams' concerns about Justice Thomas and Bruce Squire, finding both acted properly.
We consider that Appelgren received a fair trial. The appeal is therefore dismissed.
It seemed the only thing Williams and the appeal court agreed on was that Crown witness Martin's testimony was really suspect. Remember, Martin's a guy who turned from being a defence witness to giving evidence for the prosecution that he actually witnessed Ross commit the murder.
Martin's evidence certainly invites considerable scepticism. That the assault occurred before his very eyes seems unlikely.
But when it came to Ernie, the judges were much more complimentary, rejecting Williams' description of him as a manifestly and palpably unreliable witness. In its decision, the court placed a lot of emphasis on those anonymous notes Ernie had written shortly after Darcy's bashing.
Before the authorities knew what the weapon was, he not only identified it as the paddle, but also knew that it had been hidden. He was in the kitchen at the time. Plainly, he had seen something of the incident.
The judges said they also accepted Ernie's explanation, that he didn't originally tell police what he knew because he feared for his safety.
His explanation for that untruthfulness was not implausible. Then, having decided to divulge what he had seen, he remained consistent in his account of it. He was unshaken in a lengthy and testing cross-examination. No reason was suggested for him naming Appelgren rather than anyone else as the offender. The transcript of his cross-examination suggests an almost passionate rejection of allegations that he had fabricated his evidence for his personal advantage. He may well have made a strong impression on the jury, despite the forceful attack on his integrity by defence counsel in his final address.
For me, the judge's ringing endorsement of Ernie's testimony was significant. It sent a clear signal that Ross would have to come up with some really compelling new evidence to convince the court Ernie's account was a pack of lies. Surely, after 2 trials and 3 appeals, this was the final knockout blow for Ross. Okay, I'm guessing by now you're familiar with my use of these sorts of rhetorical questions. This time I'll spare you the dramatic pause because, the case took yet another crazy turn, or 3 for that matter, because not one...
I actually believe, even to this day, what I said was true, but then I don't think it is.
But 2 Crown witnesses would raise doubts about their own trial testimony.
He told me he'd lied at both trials. He was really open about it.
That's all coming up on the next episode of Nark. Thanks for listening to Nark, hosted and written by me, Mike Wesley-Smith. I'm also extremely grateful to everyone who spoke with me for this podcast, especially Suzanne Young and Julia Appelgren. And if anyone listening has more information about this case, I'd be keen to hear from you. Send an email to nark@rnz.co.nz. Follow and listen to Nark wherever you get your podcasts, and if you've enjoyed it, use the share button to recommend it to a friend. Some more quick thank yous to Ngā Taonga and Mediaworks for some of the archival audio, and to the voice actors who helped bring some of the characters in this episode to life: William Ray, Nigel Collins, Trent St. Clair, Craig Genty, Jeremy Rees, Jose Barbosa, Richard Larson and Tim Watkin. The RNZ producers who worked on this episode were Liz Garton, William Ray, Duncan Smith and Justin Gregory. The audio engineer was Ben Pearce. Thanks also to Steve Burridge and Jeremy Ansell for the studio wrangling, and to Kevin Golding for opening the doors to me every week after hours. Graphics were designed by Amrita Marks and the shorthand page where you can find more information on this story, was made by Hingyi Kong. Check it out at rnz.co.nz/nark. Tim Watkin is RNZ's Executive Editor Audio, and Brianna Uretich-Gregg is the Production Coordinator. You can find more of RNZ's great podcasts like Country Life on the RNZ website, rnz.co.nz/podcasts. Check them out. Bye for now.